Welcome to SOCAP's It's Time to Talk. I'm Fiona Brown, SOCAP Chief Executive, and joining me today is Tania Sourdin, Dean of Law from Newcastle University, SOCAP board member, and our head researcher from the SOCAP University of Newcastle research on the return on investment of effective complaints handling into public organisations. Welcome, Tania.
Hi, Fiona. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much. I'd really like to chat today about the research, the return on investment of effective complaints handling for public organisations, and to hear a little bit around why effective complaint handling is so important for public organisations. And perhaps maybe we could start off with the difference between public organisations and private organisations and the differences around the effective complaint handling outcomes.
Sure. We did a previous report on the return on investment of private organisations, and our latest piece of research looks at the return on investment for public organisations. And in saying that, the benefits to the private sector and the public sector are really quite different, and that's the major difference when we were considering how to calculate costs and benefits. So in private organisations, you're often looking at whether or not customers switch brand, to what extent there is brand loyalty, to what extent is there an additional marketing spend if a customer is lost because of ineffective complaints handling. At the government end, we were much more looking at what's the social return on investment, what actually happens if people have a positive complaint experience within government. Now, some of the benefits are similar in that you would hope that complaints data is actually used to improve government services and to improve what goes on, and they're benefits that also apply in the private sector. But there are benefits that are quite specific to government, and those benefits include, what happens if a customer, and I'll call them that even though often it's a client, actually feels more positively about government, has a greater level of trust in government or a greater level of trust in a government department. And so we were really interested, I think, in the sorts of behavioural change that could run alongside an effective complaints system.
And what did we find in the research? What are good organisations, or what does good effective complaint handling do in terms of that social return on investment?
Well, basically it may mean that people's behaviour changes. So they may have an engagement with a complaint handling team in the government sector, and as a result of that engagement may be less likely to complain again in the future, or maybe more understanding about what government is trying to do. So there might even be some behavioural change that happens, and that can be really critical in terms of what government wants to do. Also, there is that enhanced piece, for public sector or public service organisations where you've got that increased level of trust in terms of what government does, which is really what government is all about.
Absolutely, particularly when we are in perhaps a lower trust environment now. So it's very important for government organisations to rebuild or to have that trust with their clients or consumers.
Absolutely.
Were you able to extract an overall return on investment calculation for organisations to use to be able to really look at the outcomes?
It was a difficult project, as the first one was, because what we actually found was a lot of public organisations don't keep much data about their costs. So they'll keep data about when a complaint came in, sometimes, but not always, and when it left. But they don't actually keep costs in terms of personnel, administration, communication and other costs. And so quantifying those costs was quite difficult. And we were very fortunate in having data partners in terms of government to provide us with some of that information. I think also quantifying the benefits is difficult because a lot of government departments also haven't really looked at what the benefits are. And they haven't also necessarily translated where information has come through from an effective complaints handling system. What does that mean in terms of improvements for services? Because really good complaints handling systems really inform government or any organisation about how they can improve and how they can save costs into the future and how they can improve their services so that people in fact experience a better service quality right at the front end of the organisation, not just at that back end with complaints handling.
And through that, though, we know in the report that even though it has been difficult to get some of those costs, we have been able to come up with some scenarios around a potential $5 saving on that social return on investment for organisations for every dollar spent on effective complaints handling.
That's right. So we've used a series of hypotheticals which are really drawn from real life examples to show how you can calculate that return on investment, and definitely how you can show that for $1 invested in an effective complaints handling system, you can have a return of $5 or in some instances even more. And so I think that's quite exciting because it's, if you like, rethinking about the complaints area not as being a drain in terms of government expenditure, but thinking of it as actually something that generates a significant return for government.
Absolutely, and I think it also goes to the heart of really being able to transform business as a result of really listening to consumers and clients and being able to make that change from hearing not only from that one person but from many others who may not have had the chance yet to call in.
Yeah, and I must say we were very impressed with some of the effective complaints handling schemes that government has, and they're very different from one area to the next, and also very different, I think, in terms of the investment made with staff. And, you know, it was interesting to see, you know, what happens if you've got higher levels of staff attrition and what impacts that could potentially have on whether or not a system is effective. But a number of the complaints handlers were so positive about the work that they did. Their only reservation was really that they weren't sure how and to what extent the organisation used this fabulous data that they were gathering to improve their operations.
And certainly reports such as this one will really give a lot more gravitas to be able to show how that data can be used. I wanted to touch on, if I may, you mentioned that for some organisations it was around understanding what to keep, what is actually coming in as a complaint, or is it feedback? How much of an issue is that, and what does that do for the overall consumer experience or for the organisation themselves?
We found that that was really a very significant issue for public organisations and less of an issue when we looked at private organisations. And it's a significant issue for lots of reasons. One of the primary reasons is that if you're not actually capturing the small frequent complaints, then you don't actually make systemic improvements that can have extraordinarily broad benefits for all citizens who are engaging with that government department. So you've got this missing picture in relation to complaints, and I think that's really unfortunate because, again, you just can't look at overall organisational improvement. There were some other issues as well in that you were missing, or when we went in, there was this sort of missing data about other complaints that might show, you know, for example, that in one region of Australia you had a higher complaint rate because of something that was going wrong. And again, government isn't able to use that data or understand that data because it's simply missing. So that's a really significant issue for government into the future, to think about how it gathers data. And we also did form some conclusions about having better ways to complain with government, and that sort of linked into, I think, more effective referral and triage points, and also, you know, the extent to which government might use social media more actively in the future in terms of complaints.
I think that might lead us into just closing out our session today in terms of what are some of the recommendations from this research for, I suppose, twofold, for consumers and for public organisations.
And they are, because they benefit both. I mean, the recommendations are directed not just at government, but effectively consumers or citizens benefit from these kind of changes. The first major benefit in terms of looking at it is really saying, well, a change that needs to be made is, if you like, introducing a quality leadership culture so that complaints data is actually funneled up to the upper levels of public organisations and is used to make decisions about how to improve things within organisations. And I think that's something that the public sector knows already, or the private sector knows already, in that complaints data can be used very effectively in a lot of private organisations to improve the way that the system or the organisation operates. So that's really the first one. The second recommendation was around improving access, and When we talked about access in the report, it was very much around how do you have better quality referral points, how do you have more effective triaging systems, and how do you make your complaints system more visible to the public. And that is an issue in a lot of government departments. I think people find it quite hard to complain and they're frustrated, and by the time they actually get to a complaints handler, they're complaining as much about the complaints process as they are about what originally brought them there. So there's a piece there around responsiveness, I think, as well as accessibility. And then I think a lot of it was around communication and escalation, because there's some really significant cost savings if complaints don't escalate up to the next level. And quantifying those costs was actually quite hard. We didn't have a lot of information about escalation costs, because again, that sort of information tends not to be captured by government departments, but it needs to be captured, and to really look at the life cycle of a complaint and to consider, you know, why are these complaints being escalated and what's actually happened to encourage escalation. Now, there'll always be some that are escalated up, and that's because, you know, there are some citizens who may have particular views or in fact they're troubled by a legislative situation. Even so, there needs to be much more clearer pathways, and again, capturing the benefit and cost there. And then our fourth recommendation was really around governments more regularly checking in terms of citizen satisfaction. And again, that helps us better understand what the social return on investment is, and it points to those broader social return on investment questions.
Thank you so much, Tania. I think this really does add to that overall value of the essence of feedback, the essence of understanding complaints, and really being able to not only resolve those complaints, but looking at that transformative opportunity around changing business, both being it in private sector and in this case in public sector. Thanks so much for your time today. I'm with Tania Sourdin, the Dean of Law from University of Newcastle and the Head Researcher on the SOCAP University of Newcastle Return on Investment of Effective Complaints Handling in Public Organisations. Thanks for being with us for SOCAP. It's time to talk. We'll see you next time.